AITA for refusing to pay for my wife friend's meal after she called me cheap. Last Friday, my wife Emma and I decided to have dinner at a nice restaurant. It had been a long week, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening with just the two of us. I had even made an effort to choose a place that had the kind of atmosphere she liked: dim lighting, soft music, a menu with just enough variety to keep things interesting without being overwhelming. I wanted it to be one of those nights where we could just sit together, enjoy our food, and talk without the distractions of work, chores, or anything else. But before we left, Emma casually mentioned that she had invited her best friend Sarah to join us. I was surprised, though not entirely shocked. Sarah had a way of inserting herself into our plans, especially when it involved going somewhere nice. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I also didn't feel like arguing. If Emma wanted her there, so be it. I told myself I could still enjoy the night, even if it wasn't exactly what I had in mind. When we arrived at the restaurant, Sarah was already waiting at the table. She greeted Emma with her usual enthusiasm, completely ignoring me at first, which was typical. Sarah and I had never been particularly close. She tolerated me because I was Emma's husband, and I tolerated her because she was Emma's best friend. That was the unspoken agreement between us. As we settled in, the conversation flowed mostly between Emma and Sarah. I chimed in here and there, but for the most part, I just focused on my food. I had learned long ago that whenever Sarah was around, I was more of a spectator than a participant. She had a way of dominating conversations, talking about herself, her work, her latest drama, always making sure she was the center of attention. And Emma, being the kind-hearted person she was, always indulged her. The food was good, the atmosphere was pleasant, and despite Sarah's constant chatter, I was managing to enjoy myself. But then the check arrived. Without thinking much about it, I pulled out my card and placed it on the table. It was just a habit at this point: whenever Emma and I went out, I always paid. I had no problem covering our dinner. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Sarah sitting back in her chair with her arms crossed, a smug little smile on her face. "Oh, I thought you were already paying for everyone," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I had never once paid for Sarah's meal before, so I had no idea where this assumption was coming from. But I stayed calm and simply replied, "No, I'm just paying for Emma and me." That should have been the end of it. A normal person would have just nodded and grabbed their own wallet. But not Sarah. Instead, she gave me this incredulous look, like I had just told her I was leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. And then she laughed, loud enough that a couple of nearby tables turned to glance in our direction. "Wow, I didn't know you were so cheap." For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process what I had just heard. Cheap? Because I wasn't paying for her dinner? Because I wasn't covering the bill for a person I hadn't even invited? I could feel the irritation bubbling up, but I wasn't about to let her get under my skin. I smiled and said, "I didn't know you were so entitled." That wiped the smug expression off her face immediately. She went red, her jaw tightening. I could tell she wasn't used to being called out like that. She wasn't expecting me to push back. But instead of backing off, she doubled down. She scoffed and said something about how she had just assumed that since I was already paying, it wasn't a big deal. As if my money was just lying around waiting to be spent on her. As if I was being unreasonable for not wanting to foot the bill for a third person. I wasn't interested in arguing, but I also wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into paying. "I don't pay for random people's dinners just because they showed up," I said, keeping my voice even. She made a face, like she couldn't believe I had just said that. Emma, who had been silent the entire time, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I could tell she was hoping this would blow over, that I would just cave and pay to avoid the awkwardness. But I wasn't going to do that. If Sarah wanted to throw a tantrum because she had to pay for her own meal, that was her problem, not mine. Eventually, Sarah huffed and pulled out her wallet, muttering under her breath the whole time. She handed the waiter her card with an exaggerated sigh, as if this was some great injustice she was being forced to endure. I ignored her, finished my drink, and waited for the bill to be settled. When we left the restaurant, Emma was quiet. I could tell she was upset, but I didn't say anything right away. I figured she just needed a moment to process what had happened. But as soon as we got home, she turned to me with a look of disappointment. "You were really rude back there," she said. I frowned. "How was I rude?" "You humiliated Sarah in front of everyone," she said, crossing her arms. "You could have just paid and avoided all of this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So I'm supposed to pay for her just because she expects it? That's not how this works. Emma sighed, clearly frustrated. "You didn't have to make a scene." I shook my head. "I didn't make a scene. Sarah made a scene when she assumed I was paying and then tried to shame me when I said no." Emma didn't have a response to that. She just looked away, chewing on her lip like she was trying to figure out how to argue her point without admitting I was right. I wasn't trying to pick a fight with her. I understood that Sarah was her best friend, and she didn't want to see her embarrassed. But I wasn't about to let someone manipulate me into paying for something I had never agreed to. If Emma had told me in advance that she wanted me to cover Sarah's meal, maybe we could have discussed it. But springing it on me at the last second and expecting me to just go along with it? No. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night. Not because Emma kicked me out, but because I needed some space. The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. Not just because of Sarah's entitlement, but because Emma had taken her side without even considering mine. I don't know if I handled it perfectly, but I do know one thing: I'm not paying for Sarah's dinner. Not now. Not ever. Update 1. A few days later, we found ourselves at a restaurant again, this time with Sarah joining us once more. It wasn't my idea. After the last disaster, I had no intention of sitting across from her anytime soon, but Emma had insisted. She said she wanted to smooth things over, that Sarah didn't mean anything by what she said, that it was just a misunderstanding and we should all move past it. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I also wasn't interested in another argument with my wife, so I agreed. Walking into the restaurant, I felt an awkward tension settling in my chest. I wasn't the type to hold grudges, but the last dinner had left a sour taste in my mouth. Still, I told myself to let it go. If Emma wanted this to be normal, I could at least try. Sarah greeted us like nothing had ever happened, all smiles and light conversation, as if she hadn't just called me cheap a few nights ago in front of a whole restaurant. She acted like there was no tension at all, no lingering awkwardness, and for a moment, I wondered if I was overthinking everything. Maybe she really had just been joking last time. Maybe I was making a big deal out of nothing. The three of us ordered food, talked about ordinary things, and for a little while, it actually felt normal. Sarah carried most of the conversation as usual, bouncing between stories about her coworkers, a frustrating customer service experience she had, and something about a guy who had texted her out of the blue after ghosting her months ago. Emma laughed in all the right places, responded when needed, and I sat back, eating my food, nodding occasionally. It wasn't exactly how I wanted to spend my evening, but at least there was no conflict. Then the bill came. I had barely glanced at it when I noticed Sarah tilting her head, her eyebrows drawn together in exaggerated confusion. She reached for her purse, patted it absent-mindedly, then let out a dramatic sigh. "Oh, I forgot my wallet at home," she said casually, like it was no big deal. I looked at her, not saying anything. I wasn't sure if I had heard her right at first, but her expression didn't change. She just sat there, waiting. Then I turned to Emma, and the way she avoided my gaze made my stomach twist. She knew. She knew before Sarah even said it. I exhaled slowly, pulled out my wallet, and without a word, placed enough money on the table to cover just Emma and me. Then I put my wallet away, leaned back in my seat, and turned my attention to my wife as if Sarah hadn't spoken at all. "Well, sounds like your problem," I said, my voice calm. For a few seconds, Sarah didn't move. She just sat there, completely still, her eyes locked on me. It was almost comical, the way she played her part so convincingly. But then, just as quickly as the act had begun, it ended. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her wallet, and without hesitation, threw her own money onto the table. I blinked. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was so fast, so seamless, like she had never forgotten her wallet in the first place. And then it hit me, she hadn't. My chest tightened as I turned to her, my brain still processing what she had just done. "Really?" I asked, not because I needed an answer, but because I needed confirmation that she was actually as ridiculous as I thought she was. She smiled, and that smug little look was back on her face, the same one she had given me the last time. "It was a test," she said easily. "I wanted to see how cheap you were. You failed." For a second, I couldn't even react. It was like my mind had short-circuited. She had planned this. She had sat there, looking me in the eye, and deliberately lied just to see if I would pay for her. And when I didn't, when I refused to play into her entitled little game, she acted like I was the one in the wrong. I let out a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. My first instinct was to laugh, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe the audacity. But before I could say anything, I noticed Emma. She was looking at me, her lips pressed together, and something about her expression made my stomach sink. She agreed with Sarah. She wasn't saying it out loud, but I could see it in her eyes, in the way she avoided direct eye contact with me, in the way she subtly nodded as if Sarah had made a valid point. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to feel. Frustration, confusion, disbelief, all of it churned inside me, but I kept my expression neutral. There was nothing I could say in that moment that would change anything. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely registered the conversation, barely noticed Sarah's continued smirks and Emma's quiet presence. I just sat there, going through the motions, knowing that something had fundamentally shifted between me and my wife. Because this wasn't about money. It wasn't even about Sarah. It was about the fact that the person I trusted most in the world had just watched someone test me like I was some kind of experiment and decided that I was the one who had failed. Update 2. At first, I thought it was some kind of strange joke. The way Sarah had pulled that stunt at the restaurant, the way Emma had silently sided with her, it had all seemed so absurd that I told myself it couldn't be serious. It had to be some kind of twisted humor, an inside joke that I just wasn't in on. But when we got home that night, I realized it was anything but. Emma didn't talk to me all evening. She wasn't just annoyed, she was distant, cold in a way I had never seen before. Usually, after an awkward night out, she would at least try to smooth things over, make a joke, act like it wasn't a big deal. This time, she sat in silence, scrolling through her phone, avoiding eye contact, like she was waiting for me to say something first. Hours passed before she finally spoke. She barely looked at me when she did, her voice calm but firm. "You know, Sarah is right. It's not about money. It's about generosity." I felt my stomach tighten. The way she said it, the certainty in her tone, made my skin crawl. I asked her what she meant, even though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. She sighed, like she was explaining something obvious to a child, and told me that Sarah had explained everything to her. A real man pays for everyone without thinking, because he isn't afraid to show his generosity. A real man doesn't count pennies. A real man provides, not just for his wife, but for anyone who needs it, because that's what separates him from the rest. She said all of this like it was some universal truth, like it was written in stone, and I just sat there, listening, not believing my ears. It didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I noticed something shifting. Emma started repeating Sarah's phrases like they were mantras. Every time I hesitated before spending money, every time I made a practical decision, she would look at me with this calculating expression and say, "You don't want to look cheap, do you?" It wasn't playful. It wasn't teasing. It was like she was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to cave and prove that I was the kind of man she had apparently decided I needed to be. At first, I brushed it off. I thought she would snap out of it, that this was just Sarah's influence lingering a little too long. But then I started noticing other things. The way she would bring up random stories about men who took care of things, without hesitation. The way she started comparing me to other people, old friends of hers, strangers in passing. It wasn't outright criticism, but it was always framed in a way that made me feel like I was falling short of some new, impossible standard. Then I found out the truth. Sarah wasn't just some opinionated friend with a warped perspective on gender roles. She was a psychologist. She had been testing me from the very beginning. Emma let it slip one night during a conversation that was already tense, her voice almost casual when she mentioned that Sarah just wanted to see if I was really worthy of her. The words made my blood run cold. It was a test. Every single moment, the dinner, the accusations, the manipulation, had been orchestrated, not just to prove a point, but to judge me. And the worst part was that Emma had agreed. She hadn't just gone along with it. She had believed it. She had let Sarah's words sink in so deep that she had started to doubt me, to see me not as the man she had married, but as some kind of failed project that hadn't lived up to Sarah's expectations. It all made sense now. The reason Sarah had acted so entitled, the way she had deliberately provoked me, the way she had laughed when I refused to pay for her. It had never been about the money. It had been about control, about seeing if I would bend under pressure, if I would conform to some idea of masculinity that Sarah had planted in Emma's head. I tried to push it aside, to remind myself that Emma was still the person I had built a life with, that this was just some temporary influence, something she would wake up from once she realized how insane it all was. But the doubt lingered. The way she spoke to me changed. The way she looked at me changed. It was like she had been rewired, like she had been convinced that I wasn't enough, and that she deserved something better. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I asked her directly if she really thought Sarah knew me better than she did. She didn't answer right away. She turned away, hesitating just long enough for me to feel it in my gut. Then she said, quietly, "I just don't want to be with someone who isn't generous." That was it. That was the last straw. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't try to defend myself. There was nothing left to say. If she had let Sarah poison her view of me so completely, if she had allowed herself to believe that some outsider knew more about her own husband than she did, then there was no fixing this. The next day, I packed my things and moved in with a friend. There was no dramatic goodbye, no attempt to talk me out of it. She just watched, arms crossed, lips pressed together, her silence saying everything. I could tell she thought I was proving her right. That I was just running away instead of proving my worth. But I didn't care. I had spent enough time trying to meet expectations I never agreed to. I wasn't going to spend another second proving myself to someone who had already decided I had failed. Update 3. A week passed. I didn't write to Emma, and she didn't reach out either. There was no dramatic breakup scene, no desperate messages, no attempts to argue. Just silence. I wasn't sure what I had expected: anger, regret, relief. But in reality, all I felt was exhaustion. I had spent too much time trying to understand how my marriage had unraveled over something as ridiculous as a fabricated test of my generosity. I didn't have the energy to keep dwelling on it. But today, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw Emma's name. I hesitated before answering, half expecting another round of accusations or another attempt to justify what had happened. Instead, the first thing she said was, "I was wrong." Her voice was quiet, stripped of the certainty she had spoken with before. I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. She took a breath and told me what had happened. Sarah had offered to introduce her to someone, her ex-boyfriend, someone she described as very generous, someone who would take care of her without hesitation. The way Sarah framed it was almost like she was doing Emma a favor, like she was setting her up for something better, something more deserving. Sarah had told her outright that she needed someone who wouldn't make her worry about money, someone who would pay for her, for them, for everything, because that's what a real man does. I could hear the frustration in Emma's voice as she spoke, the way the realization had hit her all at once. Sarah had never cared about her happiness. She had never cared about our marriage. All she had wanted was to break something, to prove a point that only existed in her own mind. The test hadn't been about me at all. It had been about control, about seeing how far she could push Emma, how deeply she could plant doubt until it became reality. And the moment Sarah thought she had won, the moment she saw Emma without me, she had wasted no time trying to replace me. Emma had turned her down immediately, but it was Sarah's reaction that sealed everything. There was no concern, no understanding, no sadness for a friend going through a difficult time. There was only one final, dismissive remark: "Well, I told you your boyfriend was cheap." That was the moment it all became clear. The words hit differently this time, stripped of the manipulation, the twisting logic, the false wisdom she had been feeding Emma for weeks. There was no deeper meaning, no life lesson to be learned. It was just an insult, one last attempt to make her feel small. For the first time, Emma saw Sarah for what she really was. We met for coffee later that day. It wasn't an emotional reunion. It wasn't dramatic or filled with apologies and promises. It was quiet, measured, the kind of conversation that happens when two people have both been through something that changed them. She looked different, not physically, but there was something in her expression, in her posture, in the way she spoke. She looked tired but clear-headed in a way she hadn't been in weeks. For the first time in a month, there was no doubt in her eyes, no uncertainty hanging between us like a weight neither of us knew how to lift. She told me she wanted to make things right. She wanted to undo the damage, to prove that she hadn't chosen Sarah's manipulations over me, that she wasn't that kind of person. I wasn't angry. That feeling had passed days ago, replaced by something quieter, something heavier. I just told her the truth, that trust is something that needs to be rebuilt, not restored overnight. It was never about money, and it was never about generosity. It was about believing in each other, about knowing that we were on the same side, and for a while, she hadn't been. Sarah is no longer in her life. Emma cut contact the same day, deleting her number, blocking her on everything, walking away from a friendship she had once thought was unshakable. It wasn't easy for her, losing a best friend never is, even when that friend turns out to be toxic, but she didn't hesitate. There was nothing left to salvage. Now, we're back together, but without the people who think they have the right to dictate what's right for us. Without the voices that try to twist the simplest things into something they're not. It took losing each other, if only for a short time, to understand what mattered. And you know what? That was an important lesson for both of us.